After what felt like forever, we finally have another Chronicled Wish banner, and this one is Liyue themed for Lantern Rite. With it we have Xiao, Baizhu, Ganyu, Shenhe, Childe, Keqing, and Qiqi. But are any of these units still worthwhile? Let's take a look. Keep in mind that with any of these characters, they could get better with the other new characters coming in this patch, but we don't have their full kit information yet, so I won't be taking that into account for this video. With that said, starting with Shenhe, she's probably the most anticipated of these rerun characters due to how long it has taken for her to be available again. And as we know, Shenhe is a dedicated cryo buffer, providing a base damage buff to cryo damage with icy quills from her skill, as well as providing some cryo damage bonus, resistant shred, normal and charged damage bonus, but the vast majority of her damage buffing is in the base damage buff, so if you use Shenhe, you'd want to be using her with a cryo DPS, and as of right now, we have 3 primary cryo DPS units, those being Ayaka, Ganyu, and Wriothesley. With Wriothesley, Shenhe is not very synergistic with him, due to the fact that Wriothesley's skill duration will end if you swap off of him. That's bad with Shenhe, because with only one cast of her skill, she'll only provide 7 quills, which are completely gone after Wriothesley's second in 3C, or after his first in 5C if doing his C1 combo. She will buff his damage by a good amount with her icy quills while they are there, but his damage will go down tremendously once they are gone, so much so that you'd be better off just using a different team for him. So, as for example, his Vape Melt team with Farina, Xiangling, Bennett, that's a much better team. Shenhe C1 also doesn't help her synergy with Wriothesley at all, because it doesn't increase the amount of quills she gets, it just gives her a second charge of her skill. Casting her skill twice will only get you more quills if you use them up, then cast the skill again to refresh the amount back to 7, but you can't do that with Wriothesley since his skill will end if you swap. Shenhe C6, however, will fix her synergy with Wriothesley, as his normal and charged attacks will no longer consume the quills, letting all of his damage be buffed by them. She's absolutely worth using with Wriothesley at this point, but that's such a steep investment, and it would make way more sense to go for Wriothesley's own constellations instead of Shenhe's. With Ayaka, however, Shenhe's issues with her quills are pretty much non-existent, since Ayaka can swap freely, and unlike Ganyu and Wriothesley, Ayaka is actually reliant on using her burst, so Shenhe being able to help with cryo particles adds to her value here a lot. So Shenhe is best in slot with Ayaka in a freeze team like Ayaka, Kokomi, Kazuha, Shenhe. Using Farina and Charlotte instead of Kokomi and Shenhe results in more DPS on sheet, but I have heard from several Ayaka mains that this is not the case in practice. So if in that case, Shenhe is indeed part of Ayaka's strongest team, and worth getting if you're an Ayaka main. Now what about Shenhe with Ganyu? Ganyu typically does about 4 charge shots in a rotation, and her charge shots hit twice, so that's 8. Thus 7 quills will buff most of her damage, at least outside of AoE. And like Ayaka, Ganyu can swap freely, so there's not much risk in swapping back to Shenhe to recast her skill and gain more quills if need be. In my Shilonen pre-release video, I said Shilonen wouldn't be an upgrade for Ganyu because she would have to replace Shenhe, who brings too much value to her place. However, it turns out I was actually overrating Shenhe's value with Ganyu there. With a VV melt team of Ganyu, Bennett, Kazuha, Shilonen, she'll give you just about the same damage and DPS as using Shenhe, and Shilonen has the advantage of not having any damage fall off in AoE, and since she's Geo, she'll give you a crystallized shard, which will prevent you from getting interrupted by the first attack Ganyu gets hit by, which can be a huge difference maker since she has very low poise. So if you already have Shilonen for Ganyu, there is no point in getting Shenhe for her, unless you're just looking to free up Shilonen for another team, which is a very valid reason. And if you don't have Shilonen, Shenhe is worthwhile for Ganyu, but do keep in mind this is shieldless Ganyu, which can be very hard to play depending on the enemies you're facing. The Ganyu shielded teams do not use Shenhe, so if you prefer playing with a shield, there is not much point getting Shenhe for Ganyu. And speaking of Ganyu, let's now look at her. When Ganyu released in patch 1.2, she was easily the best DPS in the game, but the main reason she was so good back then is because the Abyss had low health pools, with most enemies being freezable and groupable, so the quadratic scaling from Ganyu's burst could be abused very well with Vayne's grouping on frozen enemies. The Abyss is often not set up in ways that allow this to work that well anymore, and even when it does, the damage of this team is just too low for modern day standards. Instead, Ganyu nowadays uses melt teams focused on hyper buffing her damage and melting both hits of her charged shots. As mentioned, the strongest team for this is Ganyu, Bennett, Kazuha, and either Shilonen or Shenhe. But even though the entire team is funneling as many buffs to Ganyu as possible, her damage is still below average at best for today's standards, and this is with her as a full hyper carry with no meaningful sub DPS damage alongside it, so it's pretty bad. That's also with her not having a shield, which, as we know, can be very important for Ganyu depending on the enemies. So if you're looking for a good cryo DPS, you may want to wait for Risley or Ayaka, or a future new cryo DPS, because Ganyu is very outdated. Childe is in a similar predicament to Ganyu in that he's outdated. He's still using his exact same team since 1.6. Childe's international team was considered a top tier team, even the best team in the game, by a lot of players for a long time, but now it doesn't even belong in the conversation for that. What made this team shine was having great AoE between Childe and Xiangling plus grouping, and this single target can also be really high since Xiangling can get extra hits of her burst against large hitboxes, which most bosses have. However, if you're not able to finish off a chamber in one rotation with this team, the performance really falls off hard because Childe's skill cooldown forces you to do a long 30-second rotation, and there's no meaningful damage happening for more than a third of that time. This weakness was easy to cover up in the past by just killing everything fast enough, but nowadays the HP pool of Abyss Chambers is way too high for this. With that said, he can still perform good enough if you put in the investment and effort, just don't expect him to feel like a top tier DPS, he'll be average at best. Now, like Ganyu and Childe, Xiao also released an early 1.x, but he's definitely aged way better than they have, now having a completely new team with Farazan, Farina, and Janyun, all of whom provide things for him that he desperately needed. This is a good team, definitely one of the better DPS teams in the game. It has pretty high single target damage, especially if you are getting a good amount of collision plunges, and Xiao has a large AoE on his plunges. However, the team does have some flaws that may not be apparent at first glance. While Xiao does have good AoE, Shanyun's buff only applies to one target at a time, so his actual AoE damage output is certainly not the highest out there. He's certainly better in AoE than a lot more of the single target oriented units, but compared to other DPS that can also reliably hit multiple enemies at the same time, his AoE damage will likely be lower than theirs. The other notable problem with this team is the heavy reliance on C6 Farazan, as you lose out on a lot of buffing and energy generation without it. The reason this can be a problem is that Farazan isn't on this Chronicled Wish banner with Xiao, so you can't get them both at the same time. Farazan was, however, on Xianyun's banner in 4.4, so it's possible she'll be on all of Xianyun's banners in the future, allowing you to go for 2 out of 3 of Xiao's supports at the same time. We don't know for sure if Farazan will be on all of Xianyun's banners, since she's only had one banner so far, so there's not an established pattern for that. But if she will be on all of her banners, then the Farazan reliance isn't that big of a deal. So Xiao is overall in a pretty good position, and if you want to get him on this Chronicled Wish banner, he can certainly be a good DPS for your account, especially if you have most or all of his premium team already. Just know that you will need his full premium team for him to really feel complete. And then we have Baizhu, and is it just me, or does this dude get banners all the friggin' time? He released towards the end of Sumeru, and he's already getting his 4th banner now. Strange. Anyway, Baizhu is alright. He's not some meta-defining support by any means, but he's optimal on Sino's strongest Quick Bloom teams, and he can be used as a Dendro driver in place of Nahida in teams like Double Hydro Hyper Bloom without really losing out on anything. He can also be used in Aggravate teams, though I'm not a big fan of him in Aggravate because his duration and cooldown doesn't really line up that well for the rotations that most Aggravate teams want to perform. Another use case that a lot of casual players love using Baizhu in is as the healer for Neuvillette, as Baizhu will provide great healing to stack Fanfare, and the small shields he provides can help with interruption resistance for a C0 Neuvillette. This is a valid use case for Baizhu, but just know that it won't be as strong as using him with someone like Xiao or Auroron instead. And one more thing to note with Baizhu and Neuvillette's team is that if you have Baizhu at C2, this allows him to heal and apply Dendro without ever swapping to Baizhu, resulting in much faster rotations with less time setting up and more time doing damage on Neuvillette. That's pretty great, but it's not something I'd advise pulling a C2 5-star for. And then we also have the two standard banner characters, Keqing and Qiqi. With Keqing, unless you just like her and want to play her, there's not much justification to pulling for her when Clarant is a far superior Electro DPS in pretty much every way, and Clarant is in this same patch. And with Qiqi, with all of the I pulled a Qiqi memes, I would assume most of you already have her, and if you don't, you are not missing out on anything, as she is easily one of the worst characters in the entire game. And that covers all 7 characters on this banner. To recap, Xiao is a strong DPS if you have all of his supports. In my opinion, he's probably the best character on this banner. People do overrate Xiao a lot, calling him like a top 3 DPS. He's definitely not that strong, but he's a solid A tier DPS if you have all of the right units for him. Baizhu is a good comfort unit, but the only team that he's truly optimal for is Sino Quickbloom. If you're a Sino main, you should definitely get him. Shenhe is niche to buffing Cryo, but the only Cryo DPS that truly wants her is Ayaka, though it is possible future Cryo DPS will be designed in a way that makes them work better with Shenhe. And with Childe, he's a unit that you really needed to be dedicated to, maximizing not only your investment in his team, but also your skill at mastering his rotations, so he's likely not going to feel that great if you're playing him more casually and not truly dedicated to maximizing him. And Ganyu with her current teams is pretty underwhelming, putting it nicely. It's possible a new Pyro support, maybe Mavwika, could improve her though. And yeah, that's about all. Do keep in mind that if you really like a character, you shouldn't let their meta power level deter you from pulling from them. Something very important to keep in mind is that with the Mondstadt Chronicled Wish banner, none of the characters who are on that banner have had a banner since then. So if there is a character on this banner that you want to play, you should absolutely get them, as it could very well take maybe a year, if not 2 years or more until they're back. And yeah, if you liked today's video, please be sure to give a like and subscribe and comment down below. Also consider joining my Discord, which will be in the pinned comment. Thanks and goodbye.